Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ODK Founders Day. I know there was a moment of panic as you all assumed I was going to join the university singers, but not to be this evening or at any time. But please welcome them for the opening selection. Hallelujah from the Cry of Jeremiah.
Hallelujah.
You all you had good seats. It's all right. It's time for an upgrade to the stereo system at the Lee House for sure. I know it really is meant to be. I welcome everyone to Washington and Lee ODK Founders Day Convocation, students, faculty, parents, staff, and friends here with us in Wilson Hall. And also the many joining us online through the wonders of modern technology, especially the parents who could not be here and alumni who will remember their own Founders Day Convocation and ODK induction. We are honored by the presence of all of you. In a moment, I will turn the podium over to Professor James Cobb, our keynote speaker, and then to Jillian Catterhagen, president of the Alpha Circle of ODK, who will conduct our tapping ceremony. But let me begin by asking us to reflect for a few moments on history. Our Founders Day Convocation is a time set aside by directive of the Board of Trustees of Washington and Lee, the nation's ninth oldest institution of higher education, to pause and consider the contributions of those who came before us, the values that constitute our inheritance, and the lessons we can draw from the past. On this day, we sometimes reflect on our own university's past, sometimes on the history of higher education, and sometimes on the history of our country. Why, in a busy world, is that a constructive use of our precious time and energy? Today, for example, I note 3 birthdays. One is the 100th anniversary of Omicron Delta Kappa, which was celebrated last month. Founded on December 3rd, 1914, at Washington and Lee, by a group of 15 students and faculty, the National Honor Society now has circles at over 300 institutions of higher education. It recognizes leadership, and not just leadership, but a particular kind of leadership, one characterized by a generosity of spirit and a commitment to others rather than the self. Members of ODK have already demonstrated exceptional personal and intellectual qualities. However, one of the most significant lines in the initiation ceremony is this: "You should know that the Laurel Crown Circle is not only a recognition of past exemplary conduct, but that it must also be to you a constant inspiration to finer and nobler living so long as you shall live." Membership in ODK is not simply an honor, but a lifelong obligation. Washington and Lee is proud of its role in the founding of the nation's leading leadership honor society, proud that Lexington now is the home of its national headquarters, and proud that even though ODK has forged its own path and established its own distinctive ethos, this university provided the base for its foundation. The other 2 birthdays remind us of the complexity of history and of ironies we cannot avoid. Robert E. Lee, born on January 19, 1807, was president of this institution from 1865 to 1870. He accepted that duty instead of other opportunities more lucrative and less daunting because of a deep conviction that the answers to the nation's divisions in the aftermath of the Civil War could be found only in an educated citizenry. His presidency here is a chapter of his life often overlooked because of the conflicted and tragic chapter that preceded it. Yet, for those of us who have spent time on this campus, Lee's legacy as president remains a powerful one today for its lasting influence on our academic and student life. The other birthday is Martin Luther King Jr.'s. We are celebrating King's life and legacy with our annual series of events that will continue throughout the week. The proximity of the birthdays of King and Lee forces us on this campus and in this town to reflect on 2 of the most significant times in our nation's history, the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. King frequently reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. What a long arc it was from the nation's founding to the Civil War, to the Civil Rights Movement. And while that arc may still bend towards justice, we know it doesn't of its own accord. We know that our work remains unfinished. The calendar gods compel us at Washington and Lee to think long and hard this week, as we do each year, about the sometimes painful bending of that arc. As an institution of higher learning, we embrace that complexity of history. We don't shrink from critically examining it, including critically examining our own history. Indeed, as I wrote to the community earlier this year, our own arc of history traces that of the nation, from the founding through the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, and into the challenges of the present. We cannot and should not avoid those often uncomfortable issues that a critical examination raises. We ought to lead in addressing them, as I believe we are. In our best moments, we are not like the faint of heart who deal with complexity by fleeing from it, either by resorting to caricatures of the past or by filtering the past through an ideological lens. Both of those coping mechanisms make life easier. You don't have to think as hard, but that cheapens history and defines it down rather than elevating it. I'm confident that the words you are about to hear from our speaker will elevate history and exemplify, indeed, one of those best moments. Dr. James C. Cobb, who holds the B. Finney Spalding Professorship in History at the University of Georgia, has written widely on the interaction among the economy, society, and culture in the American South. A former president of the Southern Historical Association, he is the author of several books, including his celebrated 2005 volume, A Way Down South, A History of Southern Identity, which won both critical praise and the Mary Lawton Hodges Prize in Southern Studies. A native Georgian, Cobb received his A.B., M.A., and Ph.D. from the University of Georgia. He taught at the University of Tennessee and the University of Mississippi before returning to his alma mater, the University of Georgia. Among his many honors are a stint as Senior Visiting Mellon Scholar at Cambridge University, an Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellowship from the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Study, and both the Parks Hagogi Teaching Award and the Albert Chris Janner Award for Creative Research in the Humanities from the University of Georgia. In a review of Way Down South, one critic wrote, "If you want to know what makes the South tick, you might well look to James C. Cobb for insight." Please join me in welcoming Professor James Cobb.
Thank you, Dr. Ruscio, and all of you. I cannot begin to express my truly heartfelt gratitude for the honor of being part of such an august yet celebratory occasion at such a very special place. I've been invited to speak at quite a number of colleges and universities over the years for reasons, I hasten to add, that remain quite puzzling to me, and I fear may shortly prove every bit as confounding to you. Believe it or not, though, I have actually been privileged to visit some of these campuses, including this one, more than once. Since I first came to Washington and Lee nearly 2 decades ago, I have consistently sung this institution's praises for its enduring achievement in melding an incredibly bright, curious, and motivated student body and an equally talented, accomplished, and deeply dedicated faculty into the kind of scholarly and human community to which every university should aspire. Genuinely happy as I am to be back, I suspect Thomas Nelson Page was surely every bit as pleased on June 14, 1887, when he returned to speak on the campus where he had studied for 3 years until his aristocratic Tidewater family's depleted fortunes forced him to leave without his degree in 1872. Yet, 15 years later, at age 34, Page was already a figure of some renown, owing to his popular, suffusively sentimental literary depictions of the Old South and his equally stirring evocations of the Confederate lost cause. He had come back, he explained to a truly captive student audience in Lee Chapel that evening, to deliver a message. And a university whose friend was George Washington and whose establisher was Robert E. Lee was surely the spot on earth to which my discourse is most appropriate. This, after all, was an institution whose breadth reflected Washington's magnificent ideal of a university where the youth of the whole country might acquire the grand idea of this American Union. Yet it was no less justly regarded as the citadel of that conservatism, which, mated with immortal devotion to duty, may be termed the cardinal doctrine of Southern civilization, which had found its foremost exemplar, of course, in the noblest character the South has produced, the great Lee. Such an effort to define the school's mission and heritage expansively enough to accommodate the ideals of both its great benefactors, one a founder and passionate defender of the Union, and the other a man who led the forces making war against it, may seem a bit of a stretch today. Yet, in Page's carefully crafted narrative, Washington was one of a pantheon of Southerners, obviously primarily Virginians, whose patriotism and intellect he readily invoked in insisting that 100 years ago, this nation, like Athens, sprang full panoplied from the Old South's brain. In truth, Page's hyperbole simply echoed earlier efforts to rationalize the Confederacy not as a threat to the American nation, but as a forthright and sincere attempt to restore it to the decentralized grand union of the republics known as the United States that had supposedly been the founders' aim in the first place. So wedded to this brazen affront to historical credulity were the proponents of the new Southern nation that they had even seized on the confirmed Unionist Washington as the centerpiece of its new identity, boldly installing his image not only on the Great Seal of the Confederacy, but on its currency, bonds, and postage stamps, effectively, as one historian put it, making the father of the country they were leaving the stepfather of the country they were inventing. In keeping with Robert Penn Warren's appraisal of history as the big myth we live by and in our own living constantly remake, Page wanted to see this boldly improbable spin on the genesis of the Confederacy not only sustained but integrated into a larger, compelling counter-narrative that would also do justice to the noble and refined society that it had been constructed to defend. To that end, he had actually come to Washington and Lee to proselytize, and standing beside the sacred ashes of Lee, like a Baptist minister in fervent pursuit of a new convert, he wondered aloud whether in his audience that evening there might just be a young son of the South whose father had risked or given his life for the Confederacy. If so, Page assured him that, although he might never be called upon to make the sacrifice his father had, he might yet choose a work not less noble, a career not less glorious, in preserving from oblivion, or worse yet, from misrepresentation, a civilization which produced as its natural fruit both Washington and Lee. Finally, as may have befitted a former classics major, Page waxed perhaps a tad Oedipal in his metaphors when suggesting that if any of his converts felt the impulse stirring in his bosom to consecrate it to his work, the powers nurtured at the nourishing breasts of the bountiful mother that was Washington and Lee, there could be no fitter place for him to fulfill his sacrament than these hallowed halls, and no better time than the present. Despite Page's impassioned plea for a future historian of the Old South, by today's standards, what he obviously sought was actually an apologist or propagandist. In effect, someone like him who understood the urgent need of many white Southerners at that point for a form of history which could serve not so much as a record or as a source of self-understanding, but primarily as a weapon against critical Northern attacks on the society their ancestors had so ably constructed and bravely defended. Page was hardly the first postbellum Southerner to grasp the potential power of historical memory. Washington had at least been dead for 3 generations when his name and reputation were hijacked by proponents of a cause he would likely have opposed. Lee's remains were scarcely cold, however, when formidable ex-Confederates like Jubal Early and John B. Gordon undertook to sanctify him as the untarnished and infallible embodiment of the honor, valor, and integrity that defined the lost cause of Southern independence. Silenced by death, Lee could not protest their relentless campaign to remove the single significant blot on his reputation as a commander by ensuring that James Longstreet, his procrastinating subordinate at Gettysburg, took the fall for that failure. Whatever his personal feelings, Lee had maintained a resolute public silence about the events of that day, nor had he offered anything beyond polite discouragement for any effort to raise memorials to him or to the Confederate cause, thinking it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to obliterate the marks of civil strife and commit to oblivion the feelings it engendered. Yet the deceased Lee's own feelings and wishes counted for nothing, with those bent not simply on erecting monuments to him, but in effect actually making a monument of him. It is critically important to realize here that many promoting such efforts were doing so not simply to celebrate either Lee or his cause, but rather to draw on such celebrations to energize and inspire a second crusade for Southern self-determination, although this time within what proved to be the strikingly elastic constraints of the restored Union. Within a generation of his passing, Lee had thus become the primary icon of a deftly constructed Old South golden age of the past, whose vindication absolutely demanded the creation of a New South golden age of the future. Such a notion of a historic golden age has proved invaluable to nationalists and nation builders over the centuries and around the world who have seized on it to rally support for their campaign to reclaim the stature their society had supposedly enjoyed at some earlier point. As the distinguished ethnographer Anthony Smith has explained, memories of a golden age proclaim an imminent status reversal. Though at present we are oppressed, shortly we shall be restored to our former glory. As is often the case, incongruities such as the New South's attempt to use industrial capitalism to recapture the glories of an ostensibly pre-capitalist agrarian society need not be particularly troublesome so long as a sense of spiritual continuity with that exalted past is maintained. Accordingly, while Page stressed the umbilical connection between the two, insisting that the New South was simply the Old South with its energies directed into new lines, others presented it as merely the Old South asserting itself under a new dispensation. At the same time, with the eager cooperation of state and local politicians, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other such groups were busily plastering the civic landscape with monuments and memorials offering near ubiquitous visual testimony to the New South's unwavering fidelity to the Old South's cause. Harmless as this enterprise may have seemed to many whites outside the South, black Southerners doubtless knew better, for the relentless campaign for Northern investment capital rested on assurances of both social stability and an inexhaustible supply of cheap, easily controlled labor. In effect, then, the success of the new economic order depended on the restoration, insofar as possible, of the old racial and political order. Hence, both the New South's rabid pursuit of Yankee dollars and the move to monumentalize the lost cause went hand in hand with campaigns for segregation and disfranchisement, which, in turn, replete with incendiary rhetoric, more than once fueled outbreaks of mass violence against blacks. These included the infamous Wilmington, North Carolina riot of 1898, whose principal instigator was ex-Confederate and former Congressman Alfred Moore Waddell. Condemning Yankee accounts of the war that pilloried white Southerners as ignorant, barbarous, cruel traitors and rebels, Waddell had also worked closely with the women of the state's memorial associations to secure public financing for monuments to the state's fallen sons. The only means of securing their heroic legacy, however, Waddell insisted, as he took to the stump in 1898, was stripping black men of the vote by any means necessary, even if we have to choke the Cape Fear River with carcasses. Any fears that his violent allusions might have offended the delicate sensibilities of the white society ladies who were the force behind the Confederate memorialist drive were assuaged quickly by a letter from one of their number, who confessed that she had long since grown impatient, wondering, where are the white men and the shotguns? She soon had her answer when, true to his vow, Waddell played a prominent role in the ensuing racial pogrom that left at least 25 black Wilmingtonians dead and many more of them to flee for their lives. Meanwhile, black Charlestonians immediately grasped the white supremacist implications of a prominently situated statue of John C. Calhoun, which they felt it their absolute duty to vandalize because, according to one, Calhoun seemed to be looking you in the face and telling you that you may not be a slave, but I'm back to see you stay in your place. Even before whites sought to establish their dominion over the past as one means of reasserting their dominion over the present, and in fact, even before Appomattox in some parts of the occupied South, black Southerners had begun to commemorate the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Within weeks of Lee's surrender, black citizens of Richmond, Charleston, and Augusta, to name but a few, were moving to affix their own particular significance to the July 4th Independence Day celebrations that were suddenly anathema to many whites who had so recently tried to make the American Revolution all but synonymous with the Confederate cause. By the turn of the century, it was abundantly clear that, of the 20th century, it was abundantly clear that black and white Southerners maintained sharply contrasting historical visions. As Joan Marie Johnson observed, one group celebrated the birthday of Lee, the other the life of Frederick Douglass. One read Thomas Nelson Page with tears in their eyes, while the others read Du Bois with determination. One group vilified Harriet Beecher Stowe, while the other celebrated her birthday. Such sharp divergences in historical opinion and preferences are hardly surprising. For all the facile allusions to their common or shared past, black and white Southerners have, in fact, experienced that past so differently that their perspectives on it were like the negatives and positives of the same photo. Slavery had enriched many whites but deprived and brutalized blacks. Emancipation had stripped whites of their wealth but stripped blacks of their chains. Radical Reconstruction briefly offered empowerment and opportunity to blacks while frustrating whites' efforts to restore their wealth and power, until the overthrow of Reconstruction brought yet another reversal of racial fortunes. It also foreshadowed an era of sectional reconciliation, fueled in great measure by the economic and political ambitions of a relatively small group of whites, North and South, and achieved in great measure at the expense of the interest, circumstances, and even the historical perspectives of some 4 million black Southerners. If there was ever any real doubt as to whose version of the Southern past would prevail outside the South, it was surely put to rest for more than a half century at least in Gilded Age America's tender embrace of the Old South and its lost cause, fully evident in the popular culture and public discourse of the day. If this development portended well for white Southerners determined to see their region welcomed back into the Union largely on its own racial and political terms, there was little encouragement for black Southerners in reports that even former abolitionists and radical Republicans were weeping unashamedly over Page's fictional depiction in Marsh Chan of a devoted former slave's telling of the noble but tragic story of his beloved young master. Certainly, anyone still hoping that the national retreat from Reconstruction might yet be halted found no encouragement whatsoever in the New York Times' almost gushy coverage of the unveiling of Richmond's fabled statue of Robert E. Lee before an oohing and eyeing white crowd in excess of 100,000 on Memorial Day, 1890. The Times has claimed that just as Lee's memory belonged to the American people, the monument recalling it was itself a national possession. Ominously affirmed the appraisal of an elderly black man who, observing the spectacle that day, exclaimed, "The Southern white folks is on top! The Southern white folks is on top!" Fearing as much himself, former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass condemned the nauseating flatteries and bombastic laudations of Lee that seemed to pervade the newspapers of the day. Some Northern editors joined Douglass in lamenting that a man who had spent nearly 4 years under indictment for treason should now be sporting a sort of halo of moral grandeur, courtesy of the Lee cult that seems so much in vogue even in the North these days. Even Northern journalists who readily acknowledged Lee's personal virtues took umbrage at the unfurling and waving of the flag of the so-called Confederate States at the monument's unveiling. Such ostentatious displays of the Confederate flag on occasions when the South was in the national eye surely seemed to convey, if not outright defiance, at least something short of surrender. Still, whatever the profusion of the Confederate banner might signal about the restoration of white supremacy within the South itself, the flag's prominent national association with avowedly white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan dates roughly only to the 1940s. Amid fears that the tremors unloosed by World War II might undermine the entire Jim Crow system, the Confederate flag became a fixture at rallies and marches, not only of the Klan, but a variety of post-war neo-Nazi hate groups as well. The arch-segregationist 1948 Dixiecrat revolt was practically wreathed in displays of the Confederate insignia, much to the dismay of the heirs of the memorialists who had championed its prominent but reverent and ostensibly apolitical display in Southern civic spaces. Most white racial moderates had managed up to that point to embrace the flag as a stirring symbol of a cause more ennobled by the suffering and sacrifices of their ancestors than tainted by its association with the defense of slavery. "I can buy the bravery and the suffering," Harding Carter Jr. explained, without once embracing the cause. For novelist Walker Percy, however, once the Confederate flag had flown beneath the burning crosses of the Klan and fallen into the clutches of race-baiting demagogues like Orville Faubus, Ross Barnett, and George Wallace, nothing remained but to make panties and pillowcases of it. Percy's friend Shelby Foote angrily agreed, condemning the Kluxer scum who have converted the flag from a symbol of honor into a banner of shame, and covered it with obscenities like a roadhouse men's wall. Regardless of whether the Confederate flag could once be seen as by some as the symbol of an honorable but distant past, because of its subsequent associations, one commentator explained, many Americans, white and black, now see it much the way the Jews see the Nazi swastika, a symbol not only of repression but of violence, torture, dehumanization, and death. Ironically, the Confederate flag has not only become a fellow traveler with the swastika on our own hate group circuit, but an actual substitute for it among neo-Nazis and skinheads in Germany, where displaying the swastika is forbidden by law. Indeed, the swastika's fate at the hands of Adolf Hitler offers a sad object lesson for defenders of the Confederate flag. Although it had served as a symbol of well-being and good fortune for millions of people in multiple cultures over thousands of years, since it was seized upon by the Nazis, it has signified nothing but hatred, racism, and cruelty throughout most of the Western world. Like the banner that once flew over his troops, the meaning and significance of Robert E. Lee himself as a historical icon would not emerge ultimately unscathed from the conflict and antagonism of the Civil Rights era. Embraced as a national hero, Lee had drawn a litany of tributes from an array of presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt, who hailed him as the very greatest of all the great captains that the English-speaking peoples have brought forth, and Dwight Eisenhower, who proudly displayed Lee's portrait in the Oval Office. A half-century ago, hoping to steer clear of the emerging civil rights controversy, the white officials presiding over the Civil War Centennial observance turned a blind eye to the causes of the war, emphasizing instead the heroism and dedication of its military leaders on both sides. Needless to say, Lee won the ensuing beauty contest with Grant, hands down, leaving his Union counterpart a most unlikely candidate for Miss Congeniality. Yet, though still in the making when the centennial commemoration began, the hard-won civil rights victories of the next few years would position newly empowered African Americans to mount a serious, sustained challenge to the institutionalized nobility of a man who had not only taken up arms against his country to defend the right of white Southerners to own slaves, but held them himself and more than once had made it known his belief in their racial inferiority. Much as they hoisted the Confederate flag, those on the lunatic fringe of Jim Crow's defenders had frequently invoked Lee as the patron saint of their cause, and his name had adorned many a clavern over the years. With that name disappearing from public schools and other public institutions almost weekly by the 1970s, Robert Penn Warren captured what he saw as the tragedy of Lee's misappropriated legacy in a relatively obscure poem about a white man who has murdered an Episcopal priest for supporting civil rights activism among area blacks, only to be acquitted by an all-white jury. Descending the courthouse steps after the trial, the freed killer is sorely disappointed by the absence not only of the race-baiting governor whose bidding he thought he had done, but also of any overt expression of gratitude from the local white community. Suddenly, though, he sees no more reason to give a damn if some half-assed governor shows up, for he spies the spectral figure of a uniformed Robert E. Lee, and he's waiting for me, and he's lifting his hand up to take his hat off. Yeah, Jesus, his hat off for me. The man's euphoria dissipates quickly, however, when Lee's lofted hat reveals not a face, but merely a skull, with just a few wisps of gray hair and tags of skin still attached. And then suddenly the skeletal Lee appears to be laughing. Not joyful, but so caustically, in fact, that half across the state, pine needles are shriveling up as though hit by a blowtorch, while the white paint of the state houses in Jackson and Montgomery pops up in blisters. Finally, the killer discerns that though Lee is still laughing fit to kill, or would be if he wasn't dead already, there are tears in his eyes, or at least would be if he had any eyes, For many black Southerners, the widespread assault on memorials to Lee and other Confederate icons and symbols went hand in hand with celebrating the crusade to free the South from the Jim Crow racial system constructed on the ruins of the Confederate legacy. Civil rights museums and memorials became prominent attractions in cities like Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Memphis, to name but a few. When Birmingham's Kelly Ingram Park, where demonstrators had once confronted Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses, was formally rededicated as a civil rights memorial, one of the speakers captured the importance of a heroic, monumentalized past to black Southerners when he anointed the park as the Iwo Jima of the civil rights movement. There could be little doubt that the recovery of an affirmative black past was crucial to making the South seem more comfortable and hospitable to African Americans. When travel writer Eddie Harris first came south, he had actually been ashamed that his ancestors had not lashed out physically against their white masters. Jolted emotionally by the utter profusion of Confederate flags and monuments he encounters, Harris also demands of a white Southerner, how do you expect a black person to feel in a society that so blatantly reminds him how emotionally tied his government still is to a system that fought to keep his ancestors in slavery? After learning the details of what his former slave great-grandfather had endured and then gone on to accomplish. However, Harris realizes as he rides out of Richmond that along Monument Avenue, the statues of Lee and Stewart and Jefferson Davis do not seem so chilly as before, not so frightening in their symbolism. For now I have a symbol of my own. He had gained more than that, in fact, for after uncovering his own southern roots in the South, he concludes that the South, not Africa, is home to black Americans, and black Americans as a race are essentially Southerners. One of the greatest breakthroughs accompanying the destruction of Jim Crow was soon apparent in opinion surveys, which since the late 1960s have consistently shown blacks in the South about as likely as whites to identify themselves as Southerners. And still, as Harris's experience suggests, this does not mean that the two always agree on how the history behind that identity should be represented. John Head, a black journalist in Atlanta, was quick to declare himself a Southerner, but just as quick to explain that his declaration by no means obligated him to accept the Confederacy as the South at its best, or the Confederate battle flag as an emblem in which all Georgians can take pride. Pulitzer Prize winner and future poet laureate of the United States, Natasha Trethewey, sounded a similar note when she insisted there are other Souths beyond the white Confederate South. My South didn't lose the war. We won. Who can lay claim to the South? Trethewey continued. I don't want to take it away from anyone. I just want them to recognize that it's mine too. Therein lies the rub, of course. For the fundamental complexity of history often makes it difficult to establish clear title to its symbols, which may hold dramatically divergent meanings for black and white Southerners over time. Surely we may agree, for example, that no museum dedicated to the full sweep of Southern history should be without representations of slavery and slave society. But should it not then offer as well some of the symbols and memorials to those who fought to sustain that society, making it clear in turn that they also served to bolster the postbellum crusade to restore white supremacy by erecting formidable barriers to black advancement? One of the perhaps unforeseen political benefits of toppling those barriers appears, was what seemed, at least for a time, to be a more empathetic and acute sense of history among many white Americans. Unfortunately, that more inclusive vision appears to have receded dramatically in recent years in the face of steadily intensifying cries that any obligations imposed on the present by the past have now been fully and finally discharged. Surely there is no justifying a public spatial environment where African Americans are exposed only to historical reminders that offend them. Yet, in today's conveniently forgetful political climate, there may actually be some value in such memory-jarring public juxtapositions as South Carolina's memorial to African American achievement and travail, sitting on the State House grounds just 50 yards from a statue of Confederate General Wade Hampton. Surely the sweep and complexity of Southern history was never captured more vividly or succinctly than in the now abandoned practice of projecting a laser silhouette of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the massive carving of Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson that dominates Georgia's Stone Mountain. In this respect, we might also ask ourselves if We Shall Overcome ever seems more truly compelling than when sung in places like Birmingham or Selma, where it is still very easy to remember what actually had to be overcome. Vitally important in life to the struggle to control the critical real estate between Richmond and Washington 150 years ago, in death, Robert E. Lee has surely been no less important to those who see mastery over the South's historical landscape as both an instrument and forcible reminder of their power over its contemporary affairs. If he could but know of his lengthy posthumous service as both sword, shield, and ultimately even Achilles' heel in this latter, more prolonged turf war, Robert E. Lee might surely wish that at least his unwitting participation in this aspect of the South's past could simply be entombed alongside it. Yet even if such an interment were possible, it would surely be unthinkable, least of all here. Thomas Nelson Page may have had good reason 130 years ago to believe that he had come to the best spot on earth to persuade young men to take up their pens as weapons in a new crusade to forge and sanctify a historical narrative calculated both to defend the Old South and advance the economic, racial, and political agenda of the new. Today, however, I have much better cause than Page, I think, to see this as an even more propitious spot for the very different message I've tried to offer today. As with the first tiny steps toward racial integration in southern cities, the removal or displacement of prominently displayed Confederate memorials and symbols has frequently come primarily in response to threats of image-tainting protests or economic boycotts. Though these breakthroughs themselves are surely not bad things, the encounters that produce them can invite comparisons, at least for me, to an arm wrestling tournament staged to settle which football hero's photo hangs over the bar. By this I mean that the outcome of the competition hinges not on the actual case to be made for each athlete, but simply on the relative buffness of his fan club. However righteous the apparent winner of any disagreement over historical memory may feel, the greater accomplishment in such contests comes not when one side simply bows to the superior political or economic brawn of the other, but when the differing perspectives of both are better and more empathetically understood. Not only are the odds against such a benign and broadly beneficial result utterly prohibitive in today's ideologically polarized political arena, but sadly enough, they're also quite formidable even within the intellectually rarefied environments of many of our colleges and universities. We are not at one of those places, however, but at a very special one, bearing the indelible imprint of two literally and figuratively monumental actors who have profoundly shaped both our regional and national history. This university's long and justly admired intellectual traditions, including its insistence on civil and rational discourse above all, should serve it well as its rich historical bloodline virtually commands it to maintain a vital respect for the past, while nurturing an environment where, although its power cannot be disputed, its meanings and implications most definitely can and frankly should be. If, as I fully expect, this institutional community accepts its unique obligations for all the recent consternation about the state of history and the historical profession, Washington and Lee will rightly stand as a place where we may be fully assured that the integrity and the future of the past are in the best of hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb. I predicted that you would elevate history for us, and you proved me right. Thank you very, very much. As I mentioned before, Founders Day is also a time for us to recognize several individuals for fulfilling the ideals of leadership and service. We do so by inducting them into Omicron Delta Kappa, National Leadership Honor Society. Jillian Ann Catterhagen is the president of the Alpha Circle of ODK. She is a senior from Woodlands, Texas, majoring in history and politics. She is the ODAC champion and WNL record holder in the pole vault, an all-academic track and field athlete, and choreographer for the award-winning WNL Dance Repertory Company. Indeed, Jillian has said that she chose Washington and Lee in part because she would not have to make a choice between the pole vault and dance. She proved that to herself and everyone else when, in her first year, March of her first year, She set a school record for the pole vault in the afternoon over in Wilson Field, and then ran over here and performed her first ballet solo as a college dancer in the Lenfest Center that evening. Beyond her many accomplishments, though, Jillian is a true evangelist for the liberal arts education. Here are Jillian's words in an essay she wrote for the university's website. At liberal arts institutions, we aren't moved along a production line of instruction for the sake of a career. We spend our days studying, running, dancing, arguing, acting, writing, reading, competing, discovering, and most importantly, thinking. We learn to see connections between subjects that have nothing in common on the surface. We synthesize. We strive to fuse tradition with progress. For all those who scoff at a liberal arts education, I ask them to look at the complex problems we face in our world and argue that we don't need exactly these kinds of abilities, or we need these kinds of abilities to start to solve them. Please join me in welcoming Jillian.
Thank you, President Ruscio, for your very kind introduction. I, too, would like to welcome our distinguished guests, students, families, and friends as we gather to celebrate the extraordinary accomplishments of our new initiates and anticipate their continued excellence in leadership, both here at Washington and Lee and in communities throughout the world. As President Ruscio has already noted, America today observes Martin Luther King Jr. Day. As a National Day of Service, Americans from all walks of life choose to engage in service that hosts the potential to empower individuals, strengthen communities, bridge barriers, create solutions to social problems, and move us closer to Dr. King's vision of a beloved community. Dr. King stands as one of the most passionate and impactful leaders that our nation has ever seen. So it is fitting that on this day, we also celebrate the leadership of students, faculty, alumni, and community members who have devoted themselves to leading and serving their communities and our nation. This year at Washington and Lee, Martin Luther King Day coincides with our recognition of Founders Day, always on or near the birthday of another great leader, Robert E. Lee. President Ruscio has said that this event reminds us of Lee's most enduring legacy, a particular kind of leadership, one with integrity, honor, and service to others as defining qualities. And today's celebration offers an opportunity to reflect on this particular type of leadership, embodied in the lives of these two great men. Just over a century ago, a select group of Washington and Lee student and faculty leaders founded Omicron Delta Kappa, or ODK, to bring together leaders involved in the various spheres of college life for the general good of the institution. Since its founding, the Society has sought to honor those students, faculty, alumni, and community members who best demonstrate exemplary leadership rooted in strong character, with a special eye towards the type of leadership that, in the words of General Lee, espouses the glory of duty done and the honor of the integrity of principle. As the Alpha Circle of ODK, we continue to emphasize this high caliber of leadership by recognizing those with deep-seated commitment to continued active participation in the W&L community, strong spiritual and moral character, and service to the campus, community, and the world. We are confident that our initiates will continue to demonstrate outstanding leadership in the 5 areas recognized by the Society: scholarship, athletics, service, journalism, and the arts. Many of our initiates excel in more than one of these fields, while others represent incredible depth in a single sphere. These initiates will continue in the tradition of our founders and serve to improve the world around us through honorable, innovative, and moral leadership. I am incredibly humbled by both the previous accomplishments and future potential of the student initiates honored here today. We will also welcome 4 honorary initiates into the Alpha Circle. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our honorary initiates for their unwavering commitment to the ideals of ODK, for their resolute leadership even in difficult times, and for the legacy they have created that will guide Washington and Lee students for generations to come. By their induction today into the Alpha Circle, we recognize that our honorary initiates have succeeded in demonstrating true leadership, uniting personal integrity, an inner zeal to understand and transform, and an external genius for motivating others in pursuit of a shared purpose. I look forward to seeing your leadership continue to positively influence the world around us. We will now recognize each of our initiates and invite them to the stage for the traditional tapping ceremony. I will begin today with our honorary initiates. I will call each to the stage individually, and I ask that you hold your applause until all have been introduced. Marilyn Evans Alexander is a dedicated public servant and a leader in the local community. She has been involved in volunteer organizations including Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, the VSU Alumni Association, and the NAACP. She was a founding member of the Rockbridge YMCA Board of Directors and has served on the Board of Directors for Fine Arts in Rockbridge. She is currently a member of the Kendall Board of Directors and is involved in the Lilburn Downing Alumni Association. She is treasurer for the Lexington First Baptist Church. Mrs. Alexander served on the Lexington City School Board for 10 years, including serving as its chair. She was recently re-elected to the Lexington City Council for a second term. On the City Council, she has led the Finance and Physical Services Committee and the City Manager's Search Committee. Mrs. Alexander received her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology with a minor in History from Virginia State University. She works as the property manager for the Rockbridge Area Housing Corporation. Previously, she worked on the human resources staff at Target and as an account representative for the Virginia Employment Commission. Dennis W. Cross is a leader in his profession and in the community. He is the Vice President for University Development at Washington and Lee. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy with a minor in English, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa from Vanderbilt University. He earned a Master's in Divinity and a Master's of Theology with a concentration in Philosophy of Religion from Harvard University Divinity School. He started his career at First American National Bank in Nashville. He next worked in alumni and university development, first at Vanderbilt and then at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Arts and Sciences Foundation, before advancing to Vice President for University Development at the College of William and Mary. Mr. Cross joined Washington and Lee as Vice President in 2004. He conceptualized and is the Managing Director of the $500 million Honor Our Past, Build Our Future, the campaign for Washington and Lee, the second largest campaign ever publicly announced at a liberal arts institution. He has been a vice president or senior officer at institutions recognized 12 times by the Council for Advancement and Support of Education's Circle of Excellence Award in Educational Fundraising, a top honor awarded to a small number of colleges and universities each year. He recently completed a term on the vestry at R.A. Lee Memorial Episcopal Church, where he has served as a senior warden. He is presently the chairman of the Board of Governors of Stewart Hall School and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Church Schools of the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia. Mark Edward Rush is a leader in higher education. He is the Waxburg Professor of Politics and Law at Washington and Lee. He has served as the head of Department of Politics, the director of the Program in International Commerce, and the New York Internship Program. Beginning in July of 2015, he will serve as the Director of International Education and the Center for Global Learning. Professor Rush received his PhD and master's from Johns Hopkins and his bachelor's degree from Harvard University. His publications include his recent book, Judging Democracy, as well as numerous articles and op-eds on politics and law. He also writes baseball columns. Professor Rush spent 3 years overseas as the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. There, he oversaw the expansion of the Performing Arts program, the creation of an honors program in writing, and the establishment of new relationships with numerous international institutions. In the community, he serves on the board of Friends of Rockbridge Swimming and volunteers as a youth swimming official for the Virginia High School League and USA Swimming. Julie A. Woodsika is a distinguished professor and leader in the local community. She is a professor of psychology at Washington and Lee. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, magna cum laude, at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, a Master's in Clinical Psychology at the University of Dayton, and a PhD in Social Psychology from Boston College, spending the last 2 years of her program in residence at Yale University. She began teaching at Washington and Lee in 2000 and co-taught Washington and Lee's inaugural Women's and Gender Studies introductory course. Professor Woodsika's research explores the interpersonal and social consequences of subtle prejudice and discrimination. Her research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, the Council on Undergraduate Research, and the American Psychological Foundation. She has served as chairperson for W&L's Science, Society, and the Arts Conference, and for the Institutional Review Board for Research with Human Subjects. She has been a member of numerous prominent committees and advisory boards at W&L. Professor Woodsika is a USA Swimming certified coach and promotes swimming by volunteer coaching the Rockbridge Storm swim team and teaching swimming at the Make a Splash program. She has also served as a local and district chairperson for the National PTA Reflections Program. As they return to their seats, please join me in congratulating our distinguished honorary initiates. We will now recognize our student initiates. I call your attention to the program, in which you will find a detailed listing of their many and varied accomplishments. And I will begin by welcoming our student initiates from the senior undergraduate class. Syed Haider Ali. Victoria Elizabeth Blackstone. Elizabeth Blair Davis. Anna Olivia Dorset. Bailey Elizabeth Ewing. Mary Lynn Gabe. Wilson McGee Hallett. Court B. Hammond. Sarah Elizabeth Hampton. Ashley Renee Humbert. Sarah Joanna Cora Schiff. Casey Abels McIntosh. Anne Laura Persons. Catherine Cook Rush. Eric Michael Schwen. And Brandon Elliott Taylor. Please join me in congratulating the senior undergraduate initiates. And now for the student initiates from the junior undergraduate class. Chris Jiyun An. Jacqueline Elizabeth Carson. Andrew John McCaffrey. Alice Caitlin Moore. Emma Maria Swab. Anna Russell Thornton. Pascal Stalianos Toscano. And Inga Louise Wells. Please join me in congratulating our junior undergraduate. I would now like to recognize the student initiates from the Washington and Lee University School of Law. Beginning with the law class of 2015, Terrence Anthony Austin, Stephen Robert Halpin III, Brendan P. McHugh, Ryan Christopher Red, Richard Garrett Rice, and Meg E. Sawyer. Congratulations to our 2015 Law School Initiates. And finally, from the law school class of 2016, Aria Bianca Maria Allen, Julianne Catherine Freeman, and Emily Elaine Titchener. Please join me in congratulating our excellent law initiates. I wish to offer a final congratulations to all of our ODK honorary and student initiates. Thank you again for everything you do for Washington and Lee and for our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian. We'll let the singers come up here. My thanks again to you, Professor Cobb, and to you as well, Jillian, for taking us through the induction ceremony. On behalf of the entire Washington Lee community, I offer my warmest congratulations to all of the new initiates who exemplify the ODK ideals of leadership through service, obligation to others, and individual sacrifice. And to our new initiates, I ask you to take a moment to glance to your left and look upon the accomplishments of the honorary initiates. Lexington community member Marilyn Alexander, and our W&L colleagues Dennis Cross, Professors Mark Rush, and Julie Woodsicka. Take inspiration from them and set your sights high. We will be watching with great interest as you grow as university leaders, as well as leaders in your professions and in your communities in the years to come. And now I'd ask us all to stand as the university singers sing the Washington and Lee hymn.
Hear
Thank you, and we are adjourned.